Hi there, BookTube. So we're a few days into Victober, and my challenge this year for Victober 2024 was suggesting that you experience Victorian drama by reading or listening to or watching a Victorian play. And I think that I mentioned that my favourite Victorian playwright is Oscar Wilde. And I thought I'd do a little video today about the plays of Oscar Wilde to give a bit of background and maybe encourage you to pick one up. I think I said in my announcement video that if you haven't read The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, then kind of just the one thing you should do this Victober for sure is experience that. But I have read or watched or both what I thought was all of Oscar Wilde's plays. The one I thought I hadn't yet read was Salome, which I've read for this Victober. But that's the five that are sort of well known. What I didn't know until I was doing a bit of looking to make this video is he actually wrote two other plays before those five, which are almost never read and never performed. So we learn something new every day, don't we? And I'm no particular expert on Wilde, but I do enjoy them. So let's go for it, shall we? You will already know, I'm sure, that Oscar Wilde was born in Ireland in 1854, and his parents were kind of quite intellectual, I guess. His father was a surgeon, an ophthalmologist, and his mother was a really interesting person too, and his upbringing really encouraged him to be interested in arts and literature and ideas, and he had a successful kind of academic career at university in Dublin and then in Oxford. So that's where he's coming from. And his literary career kind of starts with poetry, but he always had an affinity with and enthusiasm for the theatre. And in fact, he was particularly friendly with some of the sort of leading actresses of the day, Lily Langtry, for example, and Sarah Bernhardt. Both were women that he considered friends. So he wrote his first play when he was in his mid-20s. And this is one of the two that I hadn't even heard of, okay? And it's called Vera or the Nihilists. And it's a tragedy. And it's kind of, so this was 1880, but it's kind of loosely based on or inspired by a Russian revolutionary writer and nihilist called Vera Ivanovna Zasulich. And she was kind of in the news in 1878 because she'd attempted to assassinate a repressive governor of St. Petersburg. So he'd heard of that, I guess. But the plot, as far as I can gather, of Vera is this central figure. She's from a poor background and is a revolutionary, an assassin. She's in love with another nihilist in her group called Alexis. And little does she know, but Alexis is actually the Tsarevich, so the heir to the Tsar. And the story progresses with him becoming Tsar and her being given the job of assassinating the Tsar and getting there and finding out that it's Alexis who she loves, and then she has a dilemma and there's a sort of grand denouement. Sounds very melodramatic, tragic. Not at all the Oscar Wilde that we think of, and it wasn't a hit. Not a success at all. I think it was performed once for a week only in 1883 in America. I don't think it was ever been put on professionally in the UK, and it's not really, it's not a bit of Wilde's work that is sort of treasured as far as I can, by anyone, as far as I can gather. His second attempt at writing a play was equally unsuccessful. That was called The Duchess of Padua. Wrote it in 1883. It's a tragedy in blank verse this time, almost a bit of well, in the sort of Shakespearean style of sort of Romeo and Juliet or whatever, but probably not as good. It's, say, set in Renaissance Italy and, ill-starred lovers, that sort of thing. Again, I haven't read it. It's not commonly read or performed. I think in his lifetime it was performed again just once for 3 weeks. So did a bit better, got to 3 weeks rather than just 1 week. That was in America. And it was, in 1891. So perhaps wisely, after those two failures, Wilde had a bit of a hiatus from writing for the theatre, and he was focused on journalism and short stories, fairy stories, essays, through the rest of the 1880s. In 1891, he publishes his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. That's his only novel, his only sort of longer, more extended piece of writing. As I say, everything else was sort of like stories and short bits and plays and poetry, collections of poetry. But around the same time, he revisits writing for the theatre, and in 1891, we know he was writing what was to become Lady Windermere's Fan, but the play that he kind of completed in 1891 was Salome. And this one has a bit of a strange story to it. And this one I hadn't read myself till now. So Salome was written in French, not in English. Why did Wilde write it? I mean, his French was pretty fluent, apparently. But nevertheless, why did he write a play in France? He'd been living in Paris, or I think he was back in England by the time he completed the play. It sounds like it was a bit of a, just to see if he could, like a kind of interesting intellectual exercise, I suppose. But Sarah Bernhardt, he showed it to, and she was up for being in a performance of it. And, they were hoping to do that in London in 1891. But it fell foul of the censor. The Lord Chamberlain was the name of the censor in the UK then. And it couldn't be performed in the UK, it turned out, because it had biblical characters, and that was, as I say, against the theatrical licensing laws at the time. So, biblical characters, it's based on the story that appears in Gospel according to Mark and Matthew about the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas, so Herod II, daughter of Herodias, his wife, and that she did some kind of dance for Herod, and he rewards this by giving her the head of John the Baptist at her mother's instigation, because her mother had issues with John the Baptist. So that's the sort of the biblical story that is based on. What Wilde does with it is quite kind of different, as you might expect. And Salome, unlike the two plays that we never see or hear of, Salome is a genuinely very interesting bit of drama, but not the kind of Wilde that we think of when we think about his plays. He Bernhard, as I say, was going to perform it in French, but there was an English translation at this point, which actually came out in 1894 and was by Wilde's lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, although Wilde also kind of did a bit of editing on it, apparently. So was it performed? Was it performed in French in France? Yes, not until 1896. And by which time Wilde was in prison, of course. And so he never got to see it performed or be involved in the performance. It was first performed in the UK privately to get around the censorship after Wilde had died, I think in 1905. The first public performance, of Salome was not until 1931. So, this, it was a banned book, I suppose you describe it. Why? Because it was seen as decadent and slightly, disgraceful, degenerate even, and associated sort of, negatively with, Wilde's disgrace, I suppose. Is it a good play? I found it a really interesting play to read. It's odd. It's kind of quite symbolic. The language, certainly in the English translation, is a little stilted, a little strange. Some of it is actually, when John the Baptist, or Johannan as he's called in the play, speaks, sometimes it's actually the biblical language that's used. So hence, it's seeming a bit, odd sounding to, in the context of a sort of late 19th century bit of writing. It's very sensual, and that's the thing that has become like the real influence of the play, I suppose, because Salome in it, she's not even named in the Bible stories. Salome is this magnetic figure who's develops a kind of sexual fascination with John the Baptist, and as Wilde presents it, it's because John the Baptist rejects her sexual advances that she asks for his head on a platter as her reward for dancing for Herod. And there's a lot of kind of weird sexual tensions going on and so on. As a play, it's actually been sort of almost more influential in adaptations and other versions than in the original. So most famously, Richard Strauss, the German composer, made an opera of it that's, much more widely performed than the play itself. There are several ballets based on it. The first silent film based on it was made in 1908, so before it ever got, publicly performed on the stage. There've been several other films based on it, including most recently, and again, this had passed me by, in 2013, Al Pacino directed a version of it, and so there's a film version out there. I'm hoping to watch a different adaptation, which the National Theatre put on a few years ago, and before the end of Victober, I hope. So influential, interesting, but not the Wilde that we know and love. The Wilde that we know and love for his drama is based on the 4 plays that he wrote in the early 1890s, so kind of in effect just after Salome. Lady Windermere's Fan, that came out in 1892, A Woman of No Importance in 1893, An Ideal Husband in 1890, which was performed in 1895. The written version didn't come out until 1898, and The Importance of Being Earnest, again, 1895, but written version in 1899. So those 4, Wilde's kind of like society comedies are, what epitomizes Wilde's writing for many people, because they are so packed with his wit and his sort of social satire. All 4 of them were commercial successes. Critical successes, yes and no, mixed feelings. Some critics felt that he almost overloaded his plays, those 4 plays, with witticisms, and that was kind of unbalanced. Audiences never felt that. I think audiences always loved all 4 of those plays, and readers and theatregoers have loved them ever since, and they've all had been a history of multiple productions. So, had Wilde made a decision to kind of go populist, seek an audience for his drama rather than the rather sort of more esoteric things he'd written before. I don't think that's fair. Although they're all very funny, they also have, some quite dark elements, particularly, Lady Windermere's Fan, An Ideal Husband, and A Woman of No Importance. But all four have elements of women or men with a past, issues of mistaken identity, or kind of people leading double lives. Lady Windermere's Fan, there's a real sense of jeopardy, disaster, people making the wrong choices and potentially, may end up in disgrace. An Ideal Husband, it's blackmail and political corruption are key to the plot. And a woman of no importance. There's real kind of moral questions about inflexible morality and being wrong, but the sort of double standard that puts, treats men and women's, sexual behaviour differently, being, a cruel and unfair thing. So, there's social satire alongside the wit, and, really still, I suppose, Wilde, the subversive, is in there. Of the four, The Importance of Being Earnest, the fourth, is in many ways the lightest in tone, the most joyous and joyful and full of kind of loving relationships. But, it still has a dark tinge in places. So, all four, just, some of the best drama in the English language. So, thank heaven that Wilde didn't give up when, his first two plays, dropped like bombs, and Salome he couldn't get performed. 1895 was, a year of literary, artistic triumph for Wilde. Both An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest were in having long runs on the London stage. But, of course, 1895 was also the year of personal tragedy and disaster for Wilde. He initiated a prosecution for libel against Alfred Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, and that went to trial in 1895, and he as a result of that, in effect, Wilde condemned himself to being prosecuted for gross indecency. For having homosexual relationships. He was convicted and sentenced. Now, both An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest were being performed in London all the way through the time of the libel trial and then Wilde's trial. An Ideal Husband's run ended at the end of April. The Importance of Being Earnest carried on being performed until May, and the point at which Wilde had been convicted and sentenced. So, fascinating, isn't it? And Wilde, of course, was sentenced to 2 years hard labour, which wrecked him physically and probably also so, emotionally and mentally. After his release, he didn't write anything, of a similar character. He wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol. We also have De Profundis from that period. He did revise An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest for their written publication, but he was essentially a broken man, and he dies in 1900. How lucky we are that those four plays got written before his life fell apart, because how much we would not want to be without them. Now, if you have read this Victober or before any of Wilde's plays, do comment. I would love to hear other people's opinions of Salome. As I say, I found it pretty strange as a read, satisfying but pretty strange. what do you think? What do you think of any of the other four? And as I say, if you haven't read The Importance of Being Earnest, do that. That's the one thing that you must do. I'd say probably Lady Windermere's Fan is my other favourite out of those four, but they're all great. But most of all, I would love to know if anyone has read or seen performed, I doubt it, either Vera or the Duchess of Padua, and are they any good? And should I get around to reading them? I will have a couple more Victober theatre-related videos to come. One about the colourful life of Dion Boucicault, the early Victorian playwright who's and his play London Assurance, and you can see elements of that style in Wilde's plays. I'm also going to do a video about women in the theatre during the Victorian era, so those to look forward to.